Hello friends, today we will talk about Imperial Ideologies Part 2. In the earlier discussion in the series of History of India 1750s to 1857, we talked about the kind of ideological practices which were used by the British in India, and there we talked about Orientalism, and we talked about the kind of ideas of Oriental despotism which were used by the British to promote these kind of ideas, that how Mughals they ruled India in a despotic manner. And this idea of Mughal despotism or Oriental despotism was used by the British to suggest that British will bring some kind of a reform through law in India, so that Indians they get some kind of reprieve from the Mughal rule. So these were the kind of ideas which were promoted by the British. If you want to refer to certain readings, Thomas Metcalfe's Ideologies of the Raj, Shekhar Bandyopadhyay's From Palasi to Partition, History of Modern India, and NCERT and IGNOU material in varying way will help you in terms of your understanding in the context of the imperial ideologies. And when you tend to understand these kind of ideas, you have to in a way focus on certain concepts or certain ideas, that how these kinds of ideas or ideologies they were being used by the British in a way to attain their own interests. And when in the last lecture we talked about the permanent settlement, that how permanent settlement that was being used by the British, and this the idea of permanent settlement where fixed revenue could be secured by the British, that was one. And thereafter we see that subsidiary alliance system of Lord Wellesley was another instrument by which British they wanted to expand themselves in India. And the subsidiary alliance system was in a way one of the institutions or one of the practices by which British they expanded their rule in India. They captured many Indian states. They were in a way forced Indian states to support the British in terms of providing them money. The various kind of features which were there of the subsidiary alliance system, they benefited British in the long run. The various kinds of advantages occurred to them, and it played an important role in terms of expansion of East India Company's domination over India. So Indian states they had to surrender its external relations to the East India Company. East India Company became more and more dominant in that context, and rulers they had to cede or give some kind of territory for the army's upkeep, or either it paid some kind of money to the British in terms of cash to the East India Company. We also find that a British resident he was being sent to these states, and British resident in a way interfered in the day-to-day administration of these particular state, and no Europeans they would be employed by the East India Company, that East India by the Indian state, and they had to seek permission from the East India Company if they wanted to employ any of the Europeans. So what we find is that East India Company was trying to strangulate the Indian states in such a way that they were getting money for keeping their own armies, they were getting territory in terms of maintaining the armies of East India Company, and they were also at the same time coming to know about the internal affairs or the day-to-day administration through the posting of British resident. So in a way what we find is that these states they lost their sovereignty in some way, because the external relations of these states they were to be governed by the East India Company. So the East India Company had a number of advantages, and how they were able to maintain a huge section of army at the expense of the Indian princes. Indian princes they had to pay for the army, and British they were the beneficiaries. So we see that it was some sort of a Trojan horse tactics in terms of empire building, and how the East India Company's troops it gave English some kind of a control over the strategic and the key positions in India, and the interstate relations which were there. So any kind of a dispute between the various states they were also being guided by the East India Company, and the East India Company's resident was wielding a lot of power in the court. So we find that subsidiary alliance system which was introduced by Lord Wellesley became some sort of an instrument by which British they could exert more and more power for themselves. What we could also see is that how Indian states they became more and more subordinate in nature, and how the British resident was interfering too much in the Indian states. So this brought some kind of financial worries or troubles for the Indian states, because they had to give a lot of money to the East India Company. And many a times what happened was that East India Company was supporting the weak and oppressive rulers, and it was depriving people of any possible remedy against the misrule. So these were some kind of things which were happening in that particular context when we try to analyze the subsidy alliance system, that how subsidy alliance system was an important policy with regard to the East India Company's expansion in India. Another aspect which is also related is the paternalism of the Raj. Shekhar Bandyopadhyay, who you can see on the screen, he also talks about this idea in his book, and how paternalism came from a consistent disdain for Oriental despotism, from which India needed to be emancipated. So this kind of an idea that India had to be emancipated from the Oriental despotism, and this Oriental despotism was propagated by the Mughals, and this paternalism of the Raj, where British they will be seen as more paternal in nature towards the Indians, and the Indian despotism was that idea which was distinguishing the Oriental states from its European counterparts. But when you tend to see this kind of a situation, ironically it was the same logic which was provided and implicit justification for the paternalism of the Raj. So despotism as an idea was something which was distinguishing the Oriental state, as I talked about, from the European counterparts. But the same logic was also providing some kind of a justification for the paternalism of the Raj as well. So what we find is that any kind of emergence of a strong state on a premise that natives were not used to enjoying freedom and needed to be emancipated from their corrupt and abusive feudal lords. So this kind of an idea was promoted, that natives they were in a way not used to enjoying freedom, and they had to in a way they had to be ruled in such a way which was more oppressive in nature. So on one hand British they were talking about the in terms of exhibiting the paternalistic attitude, and on the other hand they were supporting authoritarian rule in India. So if you see the kind of institutions which were there in India, for example the Fort Williams College. So one of the reasons why Fort Williams College was established or was in a way being used was to spread the ideas of freedom which were promoted by the French Revolution in 1789, because British did not want that these ideas of French Revolution in any way should be used by the Indians, or should be in a way utilized by the Indians in some way. Some scholars like Eric Stokes, he talks about Cornwallis, that how Cornwallis he introduced the permanent settlement because with the hope that the rule of law and private property rights would liberate individual enterprise from shackles of custom and tradition, and would bring modernization to the economy. So these kind of ideas were also promoted by the scholars like Eric Stokes, where they were talking in the framework of the permanent settlement, that how the rule of law, how the ideas of property, how they would in a way bring out Indians from the customs and the traditions which were there from the earlier times, and economy would be modernized in some way. Some kind of changes in terms of economic progress would be seen in the Indian economy. But what we actually see is that these things, in whatever way they were being talked about, their main motive was to secure more and more revenue for the British or for the East India Company, and ideas with regard to promotion of soil or improvement of soil, they were not at all in a way dealt with by the British. Buttonstein is another scholar who talks about the revenue settlements, and he says that the revenue settlements they were based on the same fundamental principles of centralized sovereignty, sanctity of private property to be protected by the British laws. So the ideas of the centralized sovereignty they were there, and the idea of private property that was also to be applied when Buttonstein was also talking in that particular framework. And when we tend to see the various kinds of new intellectual currents, then we find that the idea of improvement and the idea of reform in Britain and in India, they were being talked about. And Hutchins, he talks with regard to the two schools of thought, evangelicalism and utilitarianism, that how these two schools of thought or two ideological practices, they asserted that the conquest of India had been by acts of sin or crime. So when you say that both these schools, they were talking that the conquest of India had been by acts of sin or crime, but at the same time they were not suggesting that British should withdraw from India. They were trying in the they were conveying in the framework of reform of the Indian society. Though they agree that the conquest of India is an act of sin, is an act of crime, but at the same time they did not want that British should withdraw from India, because they knew that because India was such kind of a colony which will provide so many resources, so much resources for the British. So that is why they were not talking in that particular framework. And they said that how they can bring some kind of a reform, some kind of a change in the Indian society by bringing about laws, but they did not intend that British should withdraw. Evangelicalism was another ideology or idea which was being talked about, and it began its crusade against the so-called Indian barbarism, where it was conveyed that Indians were barbaric in nature, and they needed British as some sort of a permanent rule in India so that they can reform themselves. And the missionaries at Sri Rampur at Calcutta, where Charles Grant became their chief exponent, they were there. So these kind of missionaries, those who were coming to India and those who settled themselves initially at Sri Rampur near Calcutta, and how these missionaries, they wanted to reform India by converting the Indians to Christianity, by suggesting that Christianity was the only true faith. So this idea of conversion of Indians to Christianity so that they also become more amenable or more amicable towards the colonial rule in India, and at the same time they also start practicing the British ideas. So Charles Grant religious ideas, they perpetuated the ignorance of Indian people, and this can be solved by dissemination of Christian light, and in this lay noble mission of British rule in India. So these were the ideas which were propagated by Charles Grant, and Charles Grant in a way talked about that Indian people were ignorant in nature, and the light of the Christianity will remove the kind of darkness with which Indians were afflicted. And the noble mission of the British rule in India was also to remove the kind of darkness in which Indians were there. So Christianity was seen to be some sort of a panacea, some sort of a panacea in that sense that it will solve all the problems of the Indian people when they will come out of their deep darkness. And evangelicalism was also in a way supported by William Wilberforce, who supported in the British Parliament when the Charter Act was passed in 1813, and this Charter Act allowed the coming of the Christian missionaries to India without any kind of restrictions. And this was there in the context of the free trade merchants as well, because this kind of an idea where improvement and change was also liked by them, because these things, because their products, they will become more fashionable in India, and India will become some sort of a colony for the British products, and British products which will be made in the British industries would come to India and they will be sold cheaply in India. So they were also, the free trade merchants, they were also in favor of the kind of ideas which the missionaries were also talking about, because if the ideas of Christianity will be propagated in the Indian society, then Indians will have this kind of a positive attitudes towards the British products. So when you tend to see the kind of positions which these people took, then no major difference was there with regard to the evangelist position and the free trade merchant positions. and in the context as regards the policy of assimilation and Anglicization, that how more and more Indians, they should be Anglicized. And Charles Grant, he also presided over the passage of the Charter Act of 1833, which abolished the East India Company's monopoly right over the Indian trade. That how the monopoly of the East India Company over the Indian trade was done away with in 1833, and the free traders, they also wanted that any kind of monopoly which was resting with the East India Company should be done away with, and they should get equal opportunity to misuse the Indian resources as it was being done by the East India Company for their own personal benefits. So the loot of the Indian wealth was the main motto of all the people, those who were associated with the East India Company in the garb of the ideology. And if you see in the context of the ideas of liberalism, then Thomas Macaulay's liberal vision, where he talks about how Indians, they were to be civilized rather than being conquered. So this kind of a liberal agenda was being talked about, that how emancipation of India could be done through the active governance. So when we tend to see liberalism, that this kind of a liberalism was only for the British. This kind of liberalism was not in the context of the Indians, because this kind of a liberalism was not to be utilized for them. Another ideological thought which we find was utilitarianism, and utilitarianism, which was promoted by Jeremy Bentham, which was talking about that the ideal of the human civilization was to achieve the greatest happiness of the greatest number. And Jeremy Bentham also talked about the good laws, that how the efficient and the enlightened administration, they were the most effective agents of change, and the idea of rule of law was a necessary precondition for improvement. That how the rule of law was an important aspect, and rule of law was a precondition for improvement, whereby the rule of law was to be employed, and people, they were to be reformed in such a way that they become more and more amicable towards the administration, when they will in a way try to understand the ideas of administration. And the ideological practices and the laws which will be framed keeping in mind those ideologies, they will both make India progressive in nature. This is what they propagated in India. And James Mill, he transformed utilitarianism into some sort of a militant faith. He also wrote the history of India, where he divided the history into the Hindu, Mughal as well as the British rule. Ancient, medieval and the modern period was seen in this particular framework. So that was some sort of a benchmark in the framework of the communalization of the Indian history. And British, they wanted to in a way communalize the situation for their own personal advantage, as well as we see during after the revolt of 1857, where both Hindus and Muslims, they fought together in the great revolt. So James Mill and his ideas, that how this kind of an improvement needed some kind of an effective schoolmaster, that some kind of a wise government is there and it is promulgating a good legislation. This is what was talked about. In the context of education, Macaulay's Minute on Education, it wanted to introduce the English language, and utilitarians like Mill, they favored the vernacular education as it was more suited to the Indian needs. And on the other hand, Macaulay's Minute was talking in the framework of introducing the English education. So when we tend to see the Macaulay's Minute on Education, we find that Macaulay wanted to convert the Indian into some sort of a brown sahib. He wanted to inculcate the taste, opinion, morality and intellect of a European, so that they were able to relate more with the British. And thereafter we see the Orientalist Anglicist debate as well. Before the coming of the Minute on Education, there was a lot of debate with regard to the kind of language, the kind of curriculum which was to be provided to the Indians, because the kind of money which was set aside in the Charter Act of 1830, 1 lakh of rupees every year, even that money was not spent by the British for Indian education as late as 1833. So we find that there was a lot of clamor in terms of in terms of introducing or promoting education. And Lord Bentinck, when he became the Governor General, he became some sort of an epitome of this dilemma, and he also believed in the utilitarian philosophy, and he abolished sati and the child infanticide through the kind of legislation. So at the same time he was keeping some kind of faith on the Indian traditions, and he cited that the ancient Hindu text as the scriptural logic in abolition of sati. So what we find is that Bentinck introduced certain laws with regard to abolition of sati. Raja Ram Mohan Roy was there when he was talking in the framework of abolition of sati, that how sati should be done away with. The ideas which were there with regard to the girl child or the female infanticide or the child infanticide, which was also there during the colonial period in the 18th-19th century. So legislation was also brought about with regard to the female infanticide. So these were the kind of reforms which were in a way initiated during this point of time. When we tend to see that when the revolt of 1857 took place, and many people in India and Britain, they realized that how these kind of reforms could be dangerous, in that sense that the revolt of 1857 took place, and Europeans, they need not train Indians in such a way, because the Indians could never be trained to become like Englishmen. This is what many people, they started believing, and now they were not only emphasizing India's differences but also its inferiority. So what we find that there is a great deal of change. Even earlier times, when they were talking about differences, they were not treating Indians in the same manner as they were treating the Europeans. How Indians, whether in the army or in the police, they were not given any kind of a higher position. How Indians, they were given only menial and low jobs. How Indians, they were not in a way seen into the Indian civil services. They were not being incorporated as late as 1870s, when the first time we find that someone from India, he got into the civil services. But even when this kind of a thing happens, these chances were very, very rare, because the kind of exam which was being conducted in Britain with the kind of curriculum, it was not possible for the Indians to even compete for such kind of exams. And when they were not given higher positions, when they were given low positions, then it was not possible for the Indians to prove their mettle, to work for their own countrymen. That was not possible, because largely the Europeans, they were behaving as the master race, and they were treating Indians in such a manner. As I earlier talked to you with regard to the white man's burden, the idea of Rudyard Kipling, where he was talking about the white man's burden of civilizing the Orient savage. And such racial utterances and ideological orientations, they were the bedrock of British rule in India. So what we find is that these kind of utterances, these kind of ideological orientations, they were there with regard to the British rule. And even people like Rudyard Kipling, and there were so many others, they were talking about the white man's burden, that Indians, they were savage in nature, and how the British, they have this kind of a burden, that white people, they have this kind of a burden, that they have to in a way reform or civilize the natives of India or other regions as well, because these kind of ideas were not only applicable to India but the other colonies as well, in Asia as well as in Africa, where you find that the Africans were also treated in the similar manner, not only by the British but by the other European nations, where they were trying to derive as much as advantage or resources from these people from Asia and Africa. So these kind of ideas, they were being promoted to the natives, they were being communicated to the natives, so that they lose confidence in their own traditions and customs. They have these kind of confusion regarding their own cultures, and they in a way start believing that British were comparatively more superior. British, they were far more progressive, and they have to follow or ape the British customs and traditions to become more progressive. So when we try to in a way see the various kind of ideological strands in India which were used by the British, and then we find that the ideas of British were more concerned with their own greed and the self-interest, and they were more pragmatic in this nature, that they were ready to sacrifice ideology in the context of their self-rule. Political expediency could be seen, racialism and the sense of superiority could also be seen, and they also use various methods to secure control in India. And when you talk about this kind of operation in the context of the political expediency, we find that British, they were using these kind of ideas for their own particular promotion as well as for their economic self-interest, and various kinds of methods they were being used by the British, like the Diwani rights which they got from Bengal and Bihar and Orissa, and thereafter various kinds of wars which were fought by the British, whether these were the Anglo-Maratha wars, whether they were the Anglo-Mysore wars, or wars with Sindh, wars with Punjab, and so many other regions, with Burma, Nepal, etc., all of them, Afghan wars. So all these wars, they were being used by the British to maximize their own profits, and how Indian resources they were being used by the British so that they maximize their war profits. The idea of drain of wealth could also be seen, that how money from India in the framework of various resources, in the framework of bullion, that was being taken away, and the various policies which were followed with regard to the trade and industry, whether India could see deindustrialization because of the policies of the British, whether Indians could not trade because British, they were engaged in inland as well as the other kinds of trade which was happening across seas, and at the same time the forest policy which was followed by the British to get more and more forest produced for themselves. So what we find is that all these methods, they were being used by the British to maximize their interest, and ideology just became some sort of a garb for them, so that they are able to place themselves in such a position where they can say they were more superior, and this superiority was only reflective of their inferiority, because they were taking so much from India in terms of wealth and resources. So I'd like to end this discussion here. Thank you.